When I first stepped out of high school, the world felt like a chaotic whirlwind. My family was torn apart by drama, leaving me in a vulnerable position where I had to fend for myself. I needed to find a temporary place to stay, a job to sustain myself, and somehow keep my college ambitions alive. But life had other plans. My days became a blur, filled with constant exhaustion. Sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford, and my social life, once vibrant, had faded into the background. I found myself trapped in a cycle where the basic necessities of life seemed insurmountable. With no time or energy to prepare meals, I relied on takeout cheap, greasy food that only fueled my growing fatigue. The only place I could afford to live was a refurbished storage space, which was little more than a cramped room with a bed and a few shelves. It had partial access to a bathroom, but that was the extent of its amenities. The space was cold, damp, and entirely unwelcoming. The walls were bare, except for the occasional vine creeping through the cracks, as if nature itself was trying to reclaim what little there was. The landlord didn't care about the state of the place as long as the rent was paid on time. I didn't have the luxury to be picky, so I made do with what I had. But it didn't take long for my body to start breaking down. My immune system, already weakened by the stress of my situation and the poor diet I was subsisting on, began to fail. It started with a sore throat, but within days it had escalated into something far more serious. My throat swelled so much that it felt like I had swallowed a whole apple. Breathing became a struggle, and a fever took hold that was unlike anything I had experienced before. Without health insurance or any real support, I had no choice but to swallow my pride and return to my parents. It was humiliating. We hadn't parted on good terms, but when they saw how sick I was, they took me in without hesitation. They rushed me to a doctor, who immediately put me on antibiotics, but the damage was already done. The infection had caused my throat to swell so severely that the doctors feared there might be permanent nerve damage. As the antibiotics started to work and the swelling slowly subsided, it became clear that their fears were justified. Speaking was no longer an option. Every attempt to form words was met with searing pain, as if my vocal cords were being ripped apart from the inside. The doctor gave me a grim prognosis. While my voice might return over time, it was likely that I would never fully recover. It could take months, even years, for my vocal cords to heal, and even then, there were no guarantees. For the foreseeable future, I was mute. The reality of my situation hit me like a ton of bricks. I had always taken my voice for granted, and now it was gone. I was forced to confront a new way of living, one where verbal communication was no longer possible. To make my life a little easier, I began carrying a laminated card that explained my condition. I'm mute, but even with the card, everyday interactions became a challenge. Tasks that were once simple, like ordering food, answering questions, or politely declining offers, became sources of anxiety and frustration. Each interaction was a reminder of what I had lost, and the effort it took to navigate these situations drained me, both physically and emotionally. As a result, I began to withdraw from social activities. The isolation was suffocating, but it felt like the only way to protect myself from the constant reminders of my condition. My parents, trying to help, found me a better place to live, a small apartment that was clean, safe, and more affordable than the storage space I had been living in. I also managed to secure a job stocking groceries at a local corner shop. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work that allowed me to settle into a new routine. Despite my new circumstances, the hope that my voice might someday return kept me going, but the thought of speaking terrified me. Even the slightest attempt to speak sent waves of pain through my throat. my life became a careful balancing act. I avoided anything that might upset the delicate equilibrium I had managed to achieve. But one morning, a seemingly routine phone call shattered the fragile normalcy I had constructed. I had been up late the night before, studying for an upcoming test, when the phone rang. Groggy and disoriented, I answered it out of reflex, raising the phone to my ear and almost attempting to speak. At the last moment, I caught myself and let out nothing more than a hoarse breath. I knew that if I had tried to say anything, the pain would have ruined my entire day. But then something happened that I could never have anticipated. Another voice came out of me, clear and distinct, saying, "Good morning." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I realized what had just happened. That wasn't my voice. Those weren't my words. In shock, I dropped the phone, my hands instinctively covering my mouth as if to contain whatever had just emerged from within me. The call ended, and I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what had just occurred. My mind raced through possible explanations. Maybe it was a glitch, or perhaps I was hallucinating from lack of sleep. But deep down, I knew the truth. The voice had come from me. In a daze, I stumbled to the bathroom and stood in front of the mirror, my eyes wide with fear. I opened and closed my mouth, trying to replicate the voice, but no matter what I did, all I felt was the familiar burning pain. There was no way I could have spoken without noticing it. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the mind, a symptom of stress and exhaustion, but the unease in my gut told me otherwise. Something was very, very wrong. That evening, after a long day at work, I tried to unwind by watching a show on Netflix. It was one of those trashy reality series about social media influencers, a guilty pleasure that offered a temporary escape from my troubles. As the episode reached its climax, with a dramatic reveal that one of the contestants was being voted off, I gasped in surprise, nearly choking on my takeout. And then it happened again, a light tickle at the bottom of my throat, followed by the voice whispering the word "scandalous," without my lips even moving. This time, the sensation was unmistakable. The voice was not mine, but it was coming from within me, as if something was using my body to speak. My mouth hung open, but I wasn't shaping the words. They were just there, emerging from my throat on their own. My heart pounded in my chest as a wave of terror washed over me. What was happening to me? I sat there, paralyzed by fear, and finally I mouthed a silent question, "Are you still there?" To my utter horror, the voice responded, slithering out of me with a cold, deliberate tone, "Yes." Panic gripped me. I shot to my feet, pacing the room as my mind raced with questions. What was this voice? Where did it come from? What did it want from me? The realization that there was something else inside me, something that was not me, was terrifying. Even in the familiar surroundings of my apartment, I felt a sinister presence, as if I was being watched by unseen eyes. That night, as I lay in bed, I struggled to relax. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the voice lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for a chance to speak again. The thought of it filled me with dread, and I tossed and turned, unable to find any comfort. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through social media, but nothing could shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted off to sleep, but it was not a restful sleep. Somewhere in the early hours of the morning, I woke up. It wasn't a sudden jolt, but rather a slow, unsettling awareness that something was wrong. The room was dark, and the silence was deafening. But then I heard a faint whisper, barely audible, yet unmistakably coming from my own mouth. My heart pounded as I realized that the voice was speaking, even though I wasn't consciously forming any words. The whispers were disturbing, filled with cryptic phrases that made no sense but filled me with a deep sense of dread. I caught snippets of what it was saying: you have been given so many gifts, to spoil and squander and wither. Idle children feasting on crumbs of gold. Mother, unbirth me, find me unwanting, undeserving, unsullied. Panic surged through me as the reality of the situation set in. I shot out of bed and stumbled to the bathroom, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I was terrified, confused, and desperate to make sense of what was happening to me. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything to release the fear that was building inside me, but all that came out were strange, guttural noises, and with each breath I could hear the voice, hidden in the spaces between the sounds, whispering words like "no, awful and grim." Finally, I reached my breaking point. I couldn't take it anymore. I forced myself to scream, even though I knew it would bring nothing but pain. The sound that escaped me wasn't loud, but it was enough to trigger a shockwave of agony that left me writhing on the bathroom floor, gasping for air. I had no idea how long I lay there, but eventually, I managed to pull myself together. I crawled to the toilet and spat out a glob of blood and dislodged scar tissue, remnants of the damage I had done to my throat. I stayed in the shower for what felt like an eternity, letting the hot water wash over me as I waited for the bleeding to stop. I knew I had set back my recovery by weeks, maybe even months, but at least the voice was gone. I told myself that the pain had been worth it, that I had somehow silenced whatever was inside me. Perhaps it needed something for me to speak, something I had damaged in my desperate attempt to regain control. The next morning, I woke up feeling like a shadow of myself. My throat was raw, and I found spots of blood on my pillow, a grim reminder of the previous night's ordeal. I hadn't slept much, but I forced myself to get up and go to work. I needed the distraction, and I didn't want to risk explaining what I had been through to anyone. The thought of trying to tell my parents or a doctor what had happened filled me with dread. They wouldn't understand, they would think I was losing my mind. And maybe I was. But whatever the case, I knew I couldn't face the judgment, the fear that I might be labeled as crazy. As my shift ended, I made my way to my usual takeout spot, hoping to grab a quick meal before heading home. The place was packed with people, likely from some work event, and I had to push my way through the crowd to reach the counter. As I did, something horrifying happened. The word maggot slipped out of my mouth, whispered into the ear of a random passerby. I hadn't meant to say anything, and the shock of it paralyzed me. The person turned to look at me, their face a mix of disgust and confusion. The look they gave me was the first undeniable proof that this wasn't just in my head, this was real. The voice, whatever it was, had spoken through me, and others had noticed. My heart raced as I forced my mouth shut, trying to regain control. But it didn't work. I could feel the air pushing out of my nose, and another sentence formed in my throat, ... damn them all. I froze, just a few feet from the counter, as people around me began to turn and stare. I held my breath, desperate to stop the words from escaping, but little puffs of air made my cheeks expand like a chipmunk. When I finally exhaled, a barrage of incoherent words spilled out of me, not loud but loud enough to draw attention. I felt like a madman, completely out of control. In a panic, I turned to leave, but a concerned office worker, probably in his 40s, reached out to touch my shoulder, asking if I was okay. The voice inside me reacted instantly, snapping back with a venomous hiss ... I'll suck the skin off your knuckles. Horrified, I pushed my way out of the takeout place, glancing back one last time to see a group of worried faces staring after me. Their expressions had shifted from curiosity to wide-eyed bewilderment, and I could feel their eyes on me as I stepped out into the darkness. As I walked away, the voice made itself known one final time. Yes, leave. Make us lonesome. I returned home in a daze, my mind spinning with fear and confusion. What was happening to me? What was this thing inside me? And why was it using my voice to say such horrible things? I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, and the thought of what might come next filled me with dread. The terror that gripped me that night didn't fade with the morning light. If anything, the fear had taken root deep inside me, growing stronger with each passing hour. The reality that something was inside me, something that could speak, something that had a will of its own, was overwhelming. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, manipulated by this presence. It was as if my body was no longer entirely my own, and the thought of losing control to this malevolent force terrified me. After the horrifying incident at the takeout place, I avoided speaking as much as possible. Even when I was alone, I feared that the voice might use my mouth to say something terrible again. The silence was suffocating, but it was the only way I could keep the voice at bay. My throat was still raw from the strain I had put on it, and the memory of the blood and scar tissue I had coughed up the night before was fresh in my mind. I couldn't risk another episode like that. But avoiding speech didn't mean avoiding the voice. It found other ways to remind me of its presence. Subtle things at first: a twitch in my throat, a word forming at the edge of my consciousness, an inexplicable urge to open my mouth when I knew nothing good would come of it. I began to feel its influence in other aspects of my life. It was in my thoughts, nudging me toward actions I wouldn't normally consider. At work, I found myself spacing out, losing track of time, and forgetting what I was supposed to be doing. My coworkers noticed, but I brushed off their concerns with a forced smile, too afraid to explain what was really going on. One evening, after another exhausting day of trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, I collapsed onto my bed, my body heavy with fatigue. I had managed to get through the day without any major incidents, but the weight of the voice's presence was taking its toll on me. I stared up at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of what the future might hold. Would this voice take over completely? Was I slowly losing my mind, or was this something far worse than a mere psychological break? As I lay there, my mind drifting in and out of a troubled sleep, I was jolted awake by the sensation of something moving inside me. It was subtle at first, a slight discomfort in my chest, but it quickly grew into something more insistent. I could feel it creeping up my throat, like a cold, slimy tendril worming its way out of my body. Panic surged through me, and I instinctively clamped my hand over my mouth, as if that could stop whatever was trying to escape. But it was too late. The voice was back, whispering just beneath the surface, its words barely audible but filled with malice. "You can't hide from me. You can't escape." The voice was cruel, taunting me, and I could feel the despair welling up inside me. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but I knew that any attempt to vocalize would only give the voice more power. It was using my own body against me, and I was helpless to stop it. Desperation drove me to my computer. I had to know if anyone else had experienced something like this. Maybe there was an explanation, something I could cling to in the face of this nightmare. I began searching the internet for anything that might shed light on my situation: forums, articles, videos, anything that mentioned unexplained voices, possession, or similar phenomena. The hours ticked by as I fell deeper into the rabbit hole of online speculation and horror stories. One story caught my attention. It was an old forum post from years ago, buried deep within a thread about supernatural occurrences. The poster described an experience eerily similar to mine, a voice that wasn't their own, speaking through them, saying things they didn't intend to say. The post detailed how the voice had started as a whisper, gradually growing stronger until it took over completely. The poster claimed they had tried everything to get rid of it: therapy, medication, even exorcism, but nothing worked. The voice had consumed them, driving them to the brink of madness. I sat back in my chair, my heart pounding in my chest. Was this my fate? Was I doomed to become a vessel for this malevolent presence, slowly losing myself until there was nothing left? The thought was unbearable. I had to do something, anything, to stop this from happening. But what could I do? I had already tried to fight back, and it had nearly destroyed me. As I continued to search for answers, I stumbled across a video that piqued my interest. The title was "Simple Voices That Aren't Your Own." A warning. The thumbnail showed a shadowy figure standing in front of a mirror, its face obscured. I hesitated for a moment before clicking on it, unsure if I really wanted to see what the video had to offer. But curiosity and desperation got the better of me. The video was grainy and poorly lit, but the message was clear. The person in the video claimed to have experienced something similar to what I was going through, a voice that seemed to have a life of its own, using their body to speak. The video was a warning to others, a plea for help from someone who had been through the same ordeal. The person in the video described how the voice had started as a faint whisper, barely noticeable at first, but over time it had grown louder, more insistent. They warned that the voice was like a parasite, feeding off their fear and despair, growing stronger with each passing day. The video ended with a chilling message: if you hear the voice, don't listen. Don't give it any power. It will try to break you, to take over. You have to fight it, no matter how hard it gets. Don't let it win. I stared at the screen, the words echoing in my mind. Don't let it win. But how could I fight something that was inside me, something that seemed to know my every thought, my every fear? I felt trapped, suffocated by the knowledge that this thing was growing stronger, feeding off my despair. But I couldn't give up. I had to find a way to fight back, even if it seemed impossible. In the days that followed, I tried to regain some control over my life. I focused on maintaining a routine, going to work, eating regular meals, and avoiding any situations that might trigger the voice. But the voice was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for a moment of weakness. I could feel it, like a constant pressure in my throat, a reminder that it was still there, still waiting. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I caught a glimpse of myself in the bathroom mirror. My reflection stared back at me, but there was something off, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I leaned in closer, studying my face, trying to figure out what was wrong. And then I saw a flicker of movement, so subtle that I almost missed it. My mouth twitched just for a second, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through me. I knew that movement hadn't been mine. It was the voice, trying to assert its control, trying to remind me that it was still there, waiting for its chance. I backed away from the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. The fear was overwhelming, but I couldn't let it consume me. I had to stay strong, had to find a way to keep the voice at bay. But as the days turned into weeks, the voice grew bolder. It began to speak more frequently, not just in whispers, but in full sentences. It was as if it was testing the limits, seeing how far it could push me before I broke. Sometimes it would say things that made no sense, cryptic phrases that seemed designed to confuse and unsettle me. Other times it would mock me, taunt me with my own fears and insecurities. "You're weak," it would say. "You can't fight me. I'll take over, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." The voice knew exactly how to get under my skin, how to exploit my vulnerabilities. I could feel myself slipping, losing the battle against this invisible enemy. But I couldn't let it win. I had to find a way to fight back, even if it seemed hopeless. Then one night, something happened that shook me to my core. I was lying in bed trying to calm my racing thoughts when I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest. It was as if something was stabbing me from the inside, a cold, piercing sensation that left me gasping for breath. I clutched at my chest, trying to make the pain stop, but it only grew worse, spreading through my body like ice. And then the voice spoke, louder than it ever had before. "You can't fight me. You belong to me now." The words sent a wave of terror through me. I could feel the voice's grip tightening, like a vise around my heart. I knew I had to do something, anything, to break free, but I didn't know how. The pain was overwhelming, and I was on the verge of giving in, of letting the voice take over completely. In a last-ditch effort, I forced myself to scream. The sound that escaped my throat was raw, primal, filled with all the fear and desperation I had been holding in. The pain intensified, radiating through my chest and throat, but I kept screaming, pushing through the agony. I could feel something shifting inside me, as if the scream was forcing the voice out, driving it back into the depths of my mind. But just as I thought I was winning, the voice came back with a vengeance. It was furious, its tone laced with venom. "You think you can get rid of me? You're nothing without me. I'll destroy you." The scream died in my throat as the voice took over, its words echoing in my mind. I was losing the battle, and the realization sent me spiraling into despair. The voice was too strong, too powerful. I couldn't fight it on my own. But then, in the midst of my despair, I remembered the video. The person had said not to listen, not to give the voice any power. I clung to that thought, holding on to it like a lifeline. I had to stop listening, had to stop letting the voice control me. It was feeding off my fear, growing stronger with every moment of doubt. I had to cut off its source of power. So I did the only thing I could think of. I stopped reacting. I stopped acknowledging the voice, stopped letting it get under my skin. Whenever it spoke, I ignored it, refusing to give it the attention it craved. It was hard, so hard, to resist the urge to respond, to fight back, but I knew that was what the voice wanted. It wanted me to engage, to give in to the fear and despair. At first, the voice didn't seem to notice the change. It continued to taunt me, to mock me with its cruel words. But gradually, I could sense its frustration growing. It didn't like being ignored. It wanted a reaction, wanted me to break. But I held firm, determined to starve it of the attention it needed to survive. The days passed slowly, each one a battle to maintain my resolve. The voice grew more aggressive, more insistent, trying every trick it knew to get a rise out of me. But I refused to give in. I knew that if I slipped, if I let the voice back in, it would take over completely. I couldn't let that happen. Then, one day, something incredible happened. The voice went silent. It was so sudden, so unexpected, that I didn't realize it at first. I had grown so accustomed to the constant presence of the voice that the silence felt almost unnatural. But as the minutes ticked by and the voice didn't return, a glimmer of hope sparked within me. Had I done it? Had I finally managed to drive the voice away? For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to relax. The tension in my body eased, and I let out a shaky breath, realizing just how much I had been holding in. The relief was overwhelming, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I had done it. I had won. But the victory was bittersweet. The silence, once a source of peace, now felt eerie, as if the voice was merely biding its time, waiting for the right moment to strike. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that the voice would come back, stronger and more determined than ever. And I was right. The days following the voice's sudden silence were some of the most unnerving of my life. At first, I felt a tentative sense of relief, as if I had finally managed to reclaim my life from the grip of the malevolent presence. But as the silence stretched on, what should have been a welcome reprieve began to feel ominous. The absence of the voice wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. It was as if the quiet was a prelude to something much worse, like the calm before a storm. I found myself constantly on edge, waiting for the voice to return. Every time I opened my mouth, even just to breathe, I expected to hear it speak, to feel it slither out from the depths of my throat. But there was nothing, just the empty echo of my own thoughts. The tension was unbearable. It was as if the voice had retreated, not because I had won, but because it was preparing for something far more sinister. The paranoia that began to creep into my thoughts was overwhelming. I started to question everything: my surroundings, my actions, even my own sanity. The voice had been a constant, and its sudden disappearance felt like a trick, a cruel joke designed to make me lower my guard. I couldn't trust the silence. I couldn't trust anything anymore. And then, late one night, the silence broke. I was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, too anxious to sleep. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one more frantic than the last. I kept replaying the events of the past few weeks, trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to figure out if there was something I had missed, some clue that would explain why the voice had gone quiet. But there was nothing, just a void where the voice had once been. Suddenly, I felt it, a presence, cold and sharp, like a blade pressed against my skin. My heart began to race, my breath catching in my throat as the fear surged back with a vengeance. I knew what was coming, but I wasn't prepared for it. I wasn't ready to face the voice again. But it didn't speak. Instead, it made me speak. The words that came out of my mouth were not my own, but they were spoken in my voice, in a tone so calm and composed that it sent chills down my spine. "You thought you could get rid of me," the voice said, using my own lips to form the words. "You thought you could win." I tried to scream, to shut the voice out, but my body wouldn't respond. It was as if I was trapped inside my own mind, helpless to stop what was happening. The voice continued, its tone mocking and cruel. "You're nothing without me. I am you, and you are me. We are one." Panic clawed at my chest, but I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was completely at the mercy of this thing that had taken control of my body. The fear that had been building inside me for weeks now threatened to overwhelm me, and I felt like I was on the verge of breaking down. But then something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the desperation, the sheer terror of being completely powerless, or maybe it was the remnants of my own willpower, fighting back against the darkness that had taken hold. Whatever it was, it gave me the strength to push back, to try and reclaim control. With every ounce of strength I had left, I fought against the voice, mentally pushing back against the pressure that was forcing me to speak. It was like trying to break free from chains that were tightening around my body, suffocating me. But I couldn't let it win. I had to fight, even if it was hopeless. And for a moment, just a brief moment, I felt the voice waver. It was a flicker, barely noticeable, but it was there. I pushed harder, straining against the mental and physical bonds that held me. The voice faltered, the words it forced me to say becoming disjointed, fragmented. It was losing its grip, and I could feel the control slipping back into my hands. But just as I thought I was making progress, the voice lashed out with a fury I hadn't expected. It roared inside my head, a deafening sound that drowned out my thoughts, my will, everything. I was consumed by the noise, overwhelmed by the sheer force of voice's anger. It felt like my mind was being torn apart, piece by piece, as the voice reasserted its dominance. "You think you can fight me?" the voice snarled, its tone no longer calm but filled with venom. "You think you can win? You're nothing. You're mine." The pressure in my chest intensified, the pain becoming unbearable. I could feel the voice pressing down on me, trying to crush me under its weight. My vision blurred, the world around me fading into darkness. I was losing, and I knew it. The voice was too strong, too powerful. I couldn't fight it alone. But just as I was about to give in, to let the voice take over completely, something happened. A flash of light, bright and blinding, burst into my mind. It was like a spark, a tiny flame that ignited inside the darkness. The voice recoiled, shrieking in pain as the light grew stronger, brighter. It was as if the very essence of the voice was being burned away, consumed by the fire that had suddenly appeared. I didn't know where the light had come from, but I clung to it, focusing all my energy on that tiny spark of hope. The voice fought back, trying to smother the light, but it was too late. The light had taken root, growing stronger with every passing second. The voice's grip on my mind began to loosen, the pain subsiding as the light pushed the darkness away. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I felt a sense of peace. The voice was still there, but it was weaker, its presence diminished by the light that now filled my mind. I could feel the control returning to me, the bonds that had held me prisoner beginning to break. But I knew this wasn't the end. The voice was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its chance to strike again. The light had given me a temporary reprieve, but the battle was far from over. Over the next few days, I focused on strengthening the light, nurturing it like a fragile flame. I didn't know how long it would last, but I knew I had to protect it, to keep it burning bright. The voice was still there, still trying to break through, but it was no longer the all-consuming force it had once been. It was weakened, its power diminished by the light. But even as I fought to keep the light alive, I could feel the voice growing restless. It was waiting, biding its time, searching for a weakness. And deep down, I knew that this was only a temporary victory. The voice would return, and when it did, it would be stronger, more determined than ever. Then came the night when everything changed. I was lying in bed, the light flickering softly in my mind, when I felt a cold, creeping sensation that started in my chest and spread through my body like ice. My breath caught in my throat, and the fear that had been simmering beneath the surface erupted into full-blown terror. The voice was back, but this time it wasn't alone. There was something else with it, something dark and malevolent. I could feel it, like a shadow pressing against the edges of my mind, trying to force its way in. The light flickered, wavering under the weight of the darkness that was closing in around it. I tried to focus, to strengthen the light, but the fear was too strong, too overwhelming. The voice was whispering now, soft and insidious, filling my mind with doubts and fears. "You can't stop us," it whispered, its tone filled with malice. "We are many, and you are weak. You will fall, and when you do, we will consume you." The words sent a shiver down my spine, and I could feel the light beginning to falter. The darkness was closing in, suffocating me, and I was powerless to stop it. I could feel the voice's presence growing stronger, feeding off the fear that was coursing through me. It was like a parasite, draining me of my strength, my will to fight. But I couldn't let it win. I had come too far to give up now. I had to find a way to fight back, to push the darkness away. I focused on the light, willing it to grow stronger, to push the voice and its companion back into the shadows. But the darkness was relentless, pressing in from all sides, choking the life out of the light. I could feel the voice closing in, its presence wrapping around me like a shroud. It was suffocating, draining me of my strength, my will to fight. I was on the verge of giving in, of letting the darkness consume me, when something inside me snapped. A surge of defiance, of raw, primal anger, burst forth from deep within me, igniting the light in my mind with a ferocity I hadn't known I possessed. The light blazed to life, burning brighter than ever before. The darkness recoiled, shrieking in pain as the light consumed it. The voice screamed, its cries of rage and despair echoing in my mind as the light drove it back, banishing it to the farthest corners of my consciousness. For a moment, there was silence. The darkness was gone, the voice silenced. The light filled my mind, warm and comforting, a beacon of hope in the midst of the nightmare I had been living. I could feel the tension in my body easing, the fear subsiding as the light washed over me, soothing the wounds the voice had inflicted. But I knew better than to trust the silence. The voice had been defeated, but it wasn't gone. It was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its chance to return. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. In the days that followed, I kept the light burning bright, refusing to let the darkness take hold again. I focused on rebuilding my strength, both mentally and physically, knowing that I would need every ounce of it for the battles that were yet to come. The voice was silent, but I could feel its presence, a constant, nagging reminder that the nightmare wasn't over. I knew that the voice would return, stronger and more determined than ever. And when it did, I would be ready. I had to be. The days turned into weeks, and the voice remained silent. The light in my mind had grown strong, a constant presence that kept the darkness at bay. But I knew that this peace was only temporary. The voice was biding its time, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then, one day, it happened. I was walking home from work, the sun setting behind me, casting long shadows across the pavement. The day had been uneventful, almost peaceful, and I allowed myself to relax, to enjoy the quiet. But as I turned the corner onto my street, I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest, like a knife twisting between my ribs. I doubled over, gasping for breath as the pain spread through my body. It was cold, like ice in my veins, freezing me from the inside out. My vision blurred, and the world around me seemed to tilt and spin. The light in my mind flickered, struggling to stay lit against the onslaught of darkness that was closing in. And then I heard the voice, louder and more powerful than ever before. It was no longer just a whisper, it was a roar, a deafening sound that drowned out everything else. You thought you could escape me. The voice boomed, its tone filled with rage. You thought you could win. The darkness surged, crashing over the light like a wave, smothering it in an instant. I could feel the voice's presence, all-consuming, as it took hold of me, forcing me to my knees. The pain was unbearable, a searing agony that spread through every inch of my body. I could feel the voice's anger, its hatred, as it poured into me, trying to break me, to destroy me. But I couldn't let it win. I had to fight, even if it was hopeless. I focused on the light, willing it to return, to push the darkness back. But the darkness was too strong, too overwhelming. The light was fading, and I could feel myself slipping away, the voice's grip tightening around me like a vise. And then, just as I thought I was about to lose, something incredible happened. The light blazed to life, brighter and more powerful than ever before. It surged through me, burning away the darkness, pushing the voice back with a force I hadn't known was possible. The pain subsided, replaced by a warmth that spread through my body, soothing the wounds the voice had inflicted. The voice screamed, its cries of rage and despair echoing in my mind as the light consumed it, banishing it once and for all. I could feel the tension in my body easing, the fear subsiding as the light washed over me, healing the damage the voice had done. And then, there was silence. The voice was gone. The darkness had been banished. The light filled my mind, warm and comforting, a beacon of hope in the midst of the nightmare I had been living. But even as I reveled in the victory, I knew that this wasn't the end. The voice had been defeated, but it wasn't gone. It was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its chance to return. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. The days after that harrowing confrontation were a blur. The light in my mind, now a constant, comforting presence, kept the darkness at bay. But I knew that the battle wasn't truly over. The voice had retreated, but it hadn't been vanquished. It was hiding, biding its time, waiting for the moment when I would be most vulnerable. The thought haunted me day and night, and though I tried to move forward, to reclaim some semblance of normalcy, the fear lingered like a shadow. I began to notice changes in my behavior, small, almost imperceptible shifts that made me question whether I was still in control. My thoughts were often disjointed, my memories hazy, as if someone had tampered with them. I would find myself standing in the middle of a room, unsure of how I had gotten there or what I had been doing. The light that had once brought me peace now seemed dimmer, flickering at the edges, and I couldn't help but wonder if the voice was somehow weakening it from the inside. The paranoia grew. I started to suspect that the voice had never really left, that it was still inside me, whispering in my ear, planting doubts and fears that weren't my own. Every time I opened my mouth to speak, I hesitated, fearing that it would be the voice's words, not mine, that would emerge. My sense of self was unraveling, and I was terrified that I was losing the final remnants of my sanity. I stopped interacting with people as much as possible, isolating myself in my apartment, where I could at least pretend that I was still in control. But even in the safety of my home, I felt the voice's presence, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. The silence, once a welcome escape from the chaos, now felt oppressive, as if it was pressing down on me, suffocating me with its weight. One night, unable to sleep, I sat in front of my computer, mindlessly scrolling through old messages and photos, trying to find some connection to the person I used to be. I came across a picture of myself from a year ago, smiling with friends at a party, my face full of life and joy. It felt like looking at a stranger. The person in that photo seemed so far removed from the person I had become, so distant, so unreachable. Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized just how much I had lost. My voice, my friends, my sense of self, they had all been taken from me, piece by piece, by this thing that had invaded my life. And despite all my efforts to fight back, to reclaim what was mine, I was no closer to defeating it than I had been when this nightmare began. In a moment of desperation, I did something I hadn't done in months. I reached out for help. I typed out a message to my parents, explaining everything I had been through, the voice, the struggles, the fear that I was losing my mind. My fingers trembled as I hovered over the send button, terrified of what their reaction might be. Would they believe me, or would they think I was crazy just like everyone else? Before I could second guess myself, I hit send. The message was out there now, and all I could do was wait. Minutes passed, then hours, with no response. I checked my phone obsessively, each time feeling a sinking dread in my stomach. What if they didn't believe me? What if they thought I was beyond help? But just as I was about to give up hope, my phone buzzed. My heart skipped a beat as I opened the message, bracing myself for their reaction. But instead of the rejection I feared, I was met with concern, with love. They told me they were worried about me, that they wanted to help, that they would do whatever it took to make sure I was okay. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe I wasn't alone in this. Maybe there was a way to fight back, to reclaim my life with the help of those who cared about me. But even as I clung to that hope, I knew that the final battle was looming. The voice was still there, still waiting, and I could feel its anger, its desperation growing with each passing day. It knew that I was reaching out for help, that I was trying to break free, and it wasn't going to let that happen without a fight. The tension in my mind grew, the light flickering as the voice pushed against it, trying to find a way back in. I could feel the pressure building, the darkness pressing in from all sides, as if the voice was gathering its strength for one last, all-out assault. I knew that the final confrontation was coming, and that it would be unlike anything I had faced before. The night before the confrontation, I barely slept. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. I knew that I had to be strong, that I had to hold on to the light, no matter what. But the fear was overwhelming, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a battle I couldn't win. The next day passed in a haze. I went through the motions, trying to act normal, but the tension was unbearable. Every sound, every movement felt amplified, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash. I avoided looking at mirrors, too afraid of what I might see staring back at me. I knew that the voice was watching, waiting, and I didn't want to give it the satisfaction of seeing my fear. As night fell, the sense of impending doom grew stronger. I could feel the voice stirring, gathering its strength, preparing to strike. The light in my mind flickered, the darkness pressing in from all sides, suffocating it, snuffing it out. I could feel the voice's presence, stronger than ever, and I knew that the final battle had begun. I sat on the edge of my bed, my heart pounding in my chest, as the voice began to speak. It was no longer just a whisper, it was a roar, a deafening sound that filled my mind, drowning out everything else. You thought you could escape me, it boomed, its tone filled with rage. You thought you could win. The darkness surged, crashing over the light like a tidal wave, smothering it in an instant. I could feel the voice's presence, all-consuming, as it took hold of me, forcing me to my knees. The pain was unbearable, a searing agony that spread through every inch of my body. I could feel the voice's anger, its hatred, as it poured into me, trying to break me, to destroy me. But I couldn't let it win. I had come too far to give up now. I had to find a way to fight back, to push the darkness away. I focused on the light, willing it to return, to push the voice back. But the darkness was too strong, too overwhelming. The light was fading, and I could feel myself slipping away, the voice's grip tightening around me like a vise. But then, in the depths of my despair, I felt something a spark, a tiny flicker of light buried deep within me. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I latched onto it, holding it close, focusing all my energy on that tiny spark of hope. The voice roared in anger, its grip tightening, but I held on, refusing to let go. The spark grew stronger, burning brighter, and I could feel the darkness recoiling, the voice's grip loosening. The pain began to subside, replaced by a warmth that spread through my body, soothing the wounds the voice had inflicted. The light in my mind blazed to life, driving back the darkness, pushing the voice out. The voice screamed in rage, its cries echoing in my mind as the light consumed it, banishing it to the farthest corners of my consciousness. The darkness retreated, the pain fading, and I could feel the control returning to me, the bonds that had held me prisoner breaking one by one. And then there was silence. The voice was gone. The darkness had been banished. The light filled my mind, warm and comforting, a beacon of hope in the midst of the nightmare I had been living. I could feel the tension in my body easing, the fear subsiding as the light washed over me, healing the damage the voice had done. But even as I reveled in the victory, I knew that this wasn't the end. The voice had been defeated, but it wasn't gone. It was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its chance to return. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. In the days that followed, I focused on keeping the light strong, refusing to let the darkness take hold again. I knew that the voice was still out there, still waiting, but I also knew that I had the strength to fight it, to keep it at bay. I wasn't alone in this fight. I had my family, my friends, and the light inside me to guide me. As time passed, the voice grew quieter, its presence fading into the background. The light in my mind remained strong, a constant source of comfort and strength. But I never forgot the battles I had fought, the struggles I had endured. The scars were still there, a reminder of the darkness I had faced, but they no longer held power over me. I had won the battle, but the war would always be there, a part of me that I would carry with me for the rest of my life. But I was no longer afraid. I knew that I had the strength to fight, to keep the darkness at bay, and that was enough. As I stood in front of the mirror one last time, I saw a reflection of someone who had been through hell and back, but who had come out stronger on the other side. The person staring back at me wasn't the same person I had been a year ago, but that was okay. I had changed, I had grown, and I was ready to face whatever came next. And as I walked away from the mirror, I knew that the light would always be with me, guiding me through the darkness, no matter what the future held.